Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing, but I have to confess that I'm more than just a little bit embarrassed that the American people have to see a congressional hearing dealing with the absurdity of the subject matter that we're dealing with today. Right now, Mr. Chairman, at schools across America, we're hopefully teaching our kids about the Constitution. And with all due respect to my colleagues across the aisle who keep saying that we're hypocritical for asserting that the federal government has a role here, I hope we're doing a better job of teaching our kids about the Constitution than we apparently did in teaching some of our colleagues, because the very first sentence of the Constitution in the preamble is where kids learn that the primary role of the federal government is to provide for the common defense, and the single most important part of that is ensuring the sovereignty and integrity of our territorial borders. Mr. Chairman, that's the reason that we have a federal government. That's the one thing that the federal government is supposed to do. That's the business the federal government's supposed to be in. It's not supposed to be mandating health care decisions for Americans. It's not supposed to be interfering with teachers and parents in decisions about kids' education. We have a federal government to protect Americans against people from outside our borders who might cause us harm, to protect Americans like Kate Steinle in San Francisco, and Spencer Chauvin and Jermaine Starr in Louisiana, and Peter Hacking and Grayson Hacking and Ellie Bryant in my district in Northeast Texas, all of whom were killed by illegal aliens who violated the sovereignty and integrity of our territorial borders to come to this country. And tragically, these are just 5 of the countless victims killed by illegal aliens every year. So, Mr. Chairman, if that's the primary role of our federal government, if that's why we have a federal government, are we really having a hearing about the fact that instead of enforcing our federal immigration laws, the federal government is doing the exact opposite, and as General Landry testified, is actually coercing cities into not complying with federal immigration laws? And then, to add insult to injury, the American people tuning in to this hearing today see that the very same Department of Justice that is tying the hands of law enforcement in places like New Orleans turns around and rewards so-called sanctuary cities by handing out federal funds, even though the conditions for those federal funds is that the recipients abide by federal law. And did I really hear correctly that 2/3 of all federal money going to law enforcement is going to 10 jurisdictions that refuse to comply with federal immigration laws and that harbor the most violent criminal aliens and refuse to cooperate with the federal government to deport them? That, Mr. Chairman, is as shocking as it is shameful. General Landry, you obviously share my frustration. It's why you wrote to Attorney General Loretta Lynch and asked her whether the Department of Justice, at the same time that they were enthusiastically approving and supporting the New Orleans Police Department policy, was actually also requiring the city of New Orleans to adopt that sanctuary city policy as part of the consent decree. Did Attorney General Lynch respond to you?
She finally did respond to me some months later with basically a non-answer.
Well, if it makes you feel any better, at least she responded to you. I've written her a lot of letters, and she hasn't responded to any of mine. But we have Ms. Gupta here. Ms. Gupta, you've heard from Mr. Landry, and I've heard the exchange between you and Mr. Butterworth and Mr. Richmond about really trying to clear up the record here with respect to the fact that this policy is and always was in compliance with federal law, but as has been pointed out, the record really underscores that it hasn't been, and that's why Congressman Richmond last year in the markup sought to remove that provision to prohibit sanctuary cities from receiving federal law enforcement grants because of his stated belief that New Orleans would be barred from receiving grants because of immigration provisions in the consent decree. Ms. Gupta, given that there are legitimate concerns in the New Orleans policy by folks here, did you seek a judicial review of the policy by district court to determine whether or not it complied with Section 1373?
The district court at both points, both in February and in issuing this revised policy, had reviewed the policies. Yes.
Well, my time's expired, but since the Attorney General doesn't respond to any of my letters, Ms. Gupta, I wonder if you might carry a message to her, and that message would be on behalf of my constituents and millions of Americans, that if she really believes in enforcing the rule of law, then I think she ought to be prosecuting jurisdictions that violate federal immigration policy instead of writing them checks. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Speaker.